Very human life unfolds within a network of relationships. We wake up each day and enter a web of interactions, workplaces, families, friendships, communities. In these spaces, cooperation and trust allow us to function as a society. But alongside cooperation, another force always exists: conflict. Conflict between coworkers, misunderstandings within families, unspoken resentments among friends, institutional tensions inside organizations. These tensions are not rare accidents of social life. They are structural realities of human interaction. And when conflicts begin to grow complicated, when emotions rise and communication breaks down, something interesting happens. Many people feel an instinctive urge to bring in a third person, someone who claims to explain the situation, someone who says they can pass messages between both sides, someone who appears to be a mediator. At first glance, this person seems helpful. They appear calm, composed, and cooperative. They speak in the language of balance. I understand both sides. I'll communicate things carefully. Let me handle this. But sometimes, far more often than we realize, this person is not resolving the conflict at all. Instead, they are sustaining it. Today, I want to examine a particular type of personality that emerges within conflicts. For the purpose of this lecture, we will call this figure the distortion messenger. The distortion messenger is not loud. They are rarely the one who starts the fight. They rarely appear aggressive or confrontational. In fact, they often appear gentle, responsible, even self-sacrificing. But their role is far more complex. The distortion messenger survives in a very specific environment: unresolved conflict. Without conflict, their role disappears. Without confusion, their influence fades. Without emotional distance between people, their power collapses. In other words, their existence depends on the continuation of misunderstanding. The philosophy of the in-between. To understand this phenomenon more deeply, it is helpful to borrow a concept from spiritual philosophy. In the ancient Tibetan text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a concept called bardo. Bardo refers to an intermediate state of psychological and spiritual condition between one reality and another. According to the text, during this state, the human mind is surrounded by projections of its own fears, desires, and attachments. The tragedy is that the person experiencing the bardo often fails to recognize these projections as illusions. Because they cannot see clearly, they remain trapped, repeating cycles of confusion and suffering. Now consider how this philosophical idea applies to social life. Conflict between two people often creates a social bardo. Misinterpretations multiply. Emotions replace facts. Assumptions replace conversation. And in this unstable space, this psychological fog, certain individuals thrive. The distortion messenger becomes the guardian of the bardo. Their role is not to help people exit the confusion. Their role is to manage the confusion, while distortion messengers appear only during conflict. If you observe carefully, you will notice something striking. The distortion messenger rarely appears during times of harmony. When relationships function smoothly, they are silent, distant, almost invisible. But the moment tension emerges, they suddenly appear. Why? Because conflict provides three things they need. First, conflict creates relevance. If two parties communicate directly and resolve their issues, there is no need for an intermediary. But when communication breaks down, the distortion messenger can say, "Let me clarify what each side means." Their presence suddenly feels necessary. However, if the conflict actually disappears, their role disappears as well. For this reason, their incentive is not resolution, but continuation. Second, conflict creates authority. During tense situations, people search for someone who appears calm and balanced. The distortion messenger often positions themselves in this exact posture. "I think I should organize the discussion. I understand the situation better than both sides. Let me handle the communication." Notice what happens psychologically. Without holding formal power, the distortion messenger gains informal authority. They become the person in the middle. And the middle position can quietly evolve into influence. Third conflict creates informational power. Direct communication reduces distortion, but indirect communication multiplies it. When two people speak directly, misunderstandings can be corrected immediately. But when communication travels through a third party, information becomes selective, incomplete, and interpretable. The distortion messenger gains the ability to shape narratives, not necessarily by lying, but by choosing what to include, what to omit, and how to phrase it. This creates a powerful asymmetry. One person never hears the other person's full message, and the distortion messenger becomes the sole bridge between perspectives. The illusion of neutrality, perhaps the most dangerous feature of the distortion messenger, is their self-positioning. They rarely present themselves as a participant in the conflict. Instead, they say something like this: I'm not part of the conflict. I'm only managing it. But this position creates several consequences. First, conflicts become longer. Second, responsibility becomes unclear. Third, relationships become exhausted. And fourth, the real causes of problems slowly disappear under layers of interpretation. The conflict remains alive, but its origins become impossible to trace. In this sense, the distortion messenger does not simply communicate messages. They reshape the structure of the conflict itself. Real-world examples. This pattern appears across many areas of life. Inside companies, there is often a colleague who only speaks during tense meetings. They say, Team A has a point, but Team B is also understandable. This sounds balanced, but notice something. No concrete solution follows. The meeting ends. The conflict continues. And at the next meeting, the same person appears again. Inside families, a relative sometimes acts as a messenger between parents and children. Instead of direct conversation, messages travel indirectly. Your mother said she's disappointed. Your son thinks you don't understand him, but the emotional context disappears. Misunderstanding grows, and direct communication becomes even harder. Among romantic partners, friends sometimes play the same role. Instead of confronting each other honestly, partners speak through mutual acquaintances. He's really hurt by what you said. She thinks you're being unfair. Emotions circulate, but the real conversation never happens. Even in communities, organizations, and politics, individuals can emerge who constantly position themselves as neutral mediators while never producing real decisions. They remain in the center of the conversation, but solutions never arrive. The deeper philosophical lesson from the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This dynamic is remarkably familiar. The text teaches that liberation comes not from avoiding confusion, but from recognizing it directly. Illusions lose their power when they are seen clearly. And the same principle applies to social conflict. When people speak directly, confusion dissolves. When responsibility becomes visible, manipulation weakens. When decisions are documented and structured, emotional fog disappears. The distortion messenger cannot survive in a system of direct clarity. They require ambiguity. They require emotional distance. They require a prolonged bardo, the essential defense. So, what should we learn from this? The answer is surprisingly simple. First, speak directly. Second, resolve issues publicly and transparently. Third, reduce unnecessary intermediaries. Fourth, establish structures where responsibility remains visible. These principles are not only organizational strategies, they are also philosophical disciplines. They protect relationships from drifting into confusion, and they prevent conflicts from becoming endless cycles. In spiritual language, they help us leave the bardo, because the greatest danger in conflict is not disagreement. It is remaining trapped in misunderstanding. And once we recognize the role of the distortion messenger, we gain the ability to do something profoundly important: to see clearly, to listen directly, and to resolve conflicts without surrendering our judgment to those who thrive in the shadows between people. If this perspective helped you see human relationships in a new way, consider subscribing to this channel. Here we explore the hidden psychology of conflict, leadership, and human behavior through the lens of philosophy, history, and real life. Because understanding people is not simply about avoiding problems. It is about learning how clarity defeats confusion. At the end of our previous discussion, we arrived at a crucial realization. Conflicts rarely persist because people are incapable of solving them. More often, conflicts persist because the structure surrounding the conflict quietly prevents resolution. When confusion is constantly interpreted, translated, and softened by intermediaries, people stop confronting each other directly. And when direct confrontation disappears, something far more dangerous appears in its place. A comfortable illusion of stability. At first, nothing seems wrong. Meetings continue. Reports arrive on time. No one openly argues. From the leader's perspective, the organization appears calm. But in reality, the conflict has not disappeared. It has simply moved out of the leader's field of vision. And this leads us to a critical question. Why do leaders fail to recognize this structure in its early stages? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because the distortion messenger looks extremely useful to the leader. From the leader's perspective, this person appears in three reassuring forms. First, they appear to be the person who never brings problems. Second, they appear to be the person who handles uncomfortable conversations for the leader. Third, they appear to be the person who absorbs emotional tension for the sake of the organization. In other words, the distortion messenger presents themselves as a source of comfort. And comfort can be dangerously persuasive in leadership. The illusion of the problem-free person. In every organization, there is often one individual who seems remarkably easy to manage. They rarely complain. They rarely create conflict. They rarely demand difficult decisions. To a busy leader, this individual appears ideal. But look more closely. This person may not be preventing problems. They may simply be preventing problems from becoming visible. Consider a common scenario. During a meeting, two teams disagree about a critical issue. Instead of confronting the disagreement directly, this person remains quiet. They observe. They listen. They say nothing. From the leader's perspective, this silence feels responsible. This person doesn't create conflict. But in reality, silence is not neutrality. Sometimes silence is simply strategic observation. The distortion messenger collects information quietly, without ever committing to a clear position. And because they never openly challenge anyone, they appear safe. But safety and clarity are not the same thing. The emotional coordinator illusion. Another common role played by the distortion messenger is that of the emotional harmonizer. Whenever tensions rise between colleagues, they step forward. They soften the tone of conversations. They reassure people that misunderstandings are temporary. They say things like, "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be," or "I think everyone just needs to calm down." On the surface, this appears constructive. But notice the subtle shift. The conflict is no longer treated as a problem to solve. It becomes framed as a feeling to manage. The original issue, the decision, the responsibility, the structural problem, quietly disappears. And when leaders see tensions calm down, they often assume stability has returned. But the conflict has not been resolved. It has simply been emotionalized instead of analyzed. The comfortable shield around leadership. The distortion messenger also performs another role that leaders find particularly comforting. They present themselves as a protective buffer. Instead of bringing difficult news directly to the leader, they filter it. They soften criticism. They summarize complaints. They say things like, "Nothing serious, just a small misunderstanding," or "I've already handled the emotional side of this issue." To a leader under pressure, this sounds helpful. It reduces stress. It simplifies communication. But this protection comes at a hidden cost. When information is filtered, the leader receives a version of reality, not reality itself. The organization begins operating inside a curated narrative. Problems are edited. Criticism is diluted. Conflicts are rephrased. And gradually the leader becomes strategically blind. The philosophy of courage in leadership. If we look at this situation through the lens of philosophy, the lesson becomes clearer. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a recurring message about courage and perception. The text suggests that the greatest obstacle to awakening is not external danger, but the fear of seeing things clearly. Illusions often appear comforting, but comfort can trap the mind inside cycles of confusion. In spiritual terms, this condition is known as bardo, a state in which perception is clouded by projections and attachments. Leadership can fall into the same condition. When leaders rely on filtered information and emotional mediation, they begin to operate inside a managerial bardo. They believe they are maintaining harmony, but in reality, they are drifting further away from the truth of their organization. True leadership requires something far less comfortable. It requires direct confrontation with reality. The second mask of the distortion messenger, the person who handles difficult conversations. Another way the distortion messenger gains influence is by presenting themselves as someone who handles uncomfortable discussions on behalf of others. At first, this role appears incredibly valuable. They seem to protect colleagues from confrontation. They appear to help leaders avoid unnecessary tension. But this function contains a dangerous distortion. Instead of facilitating direct dialogue, they replace it. Messages are relayed indirectly. Criticism is reinterpreted. Intentions are guessed rather than confirmed. Consider a simple example. A team member expresses concern about a project decision. Instead of encouraging that person to speak directly with the leader, the distortion messenger says, "I'll explain it to them." What happens next is subtle but powerful. The message is no longer delivered by the original speaker. It becomes an interpretation. Tone changes, meaning shifts, context disappears. And with every layer of translation, the distance between reality and leadership grows wider. When organizations enter the fog, over time, this pattern creates predictable consequences. Responsibility becomes unclear. Decisions become delayed. Frustration grows quietly inside teams. But because no conflict appears openly, leaders often fail to recognize the severity of the problem. The organization appears calm on the surface, but beneath the surface, energy is draining away. Trust weakens, clarity fades, and eventually the organization begins operating inside a fog of interpretation. In this fog, people stop asking direct questions. Instead, they ask, what does that person really mean? What did the leader actually intend? Who is really responsible? These are the questions of an organization that has lost its structural clarity. The third mask, the person who sacrifices emotion for the organization, perhaps the most persuasive identity the distortion messenger adopts, is the image of sacrifice. They portray themselves as someone who absorbs emotional tension for the good of the group. They say things like, "I'll deal with the emotional fallout. Let me carry the difficult conversations." To many leaders, this appears noble. It seems like loyalty. But emotional absorption can also be a strategy. When all tensions flow through one individual, that individual becomes the center of relational gravity. Every conversation passes through them. Every complaint reaches them first. Every misunderstanding becomes their interpretation. At that point, they are no longer a mediator. They become the bottleneck of the organization. And bottlenecks eventually determine the speed and direction of entire systems. The language of influence without responsibility. One of the most subtle signals of the distortion. Messenger appears in language itself. Organizations move through language. Reports are written in language. Evaluations are expressed through language. Decisions are justified through language. When language changes, the organization begins to change. Distortion messengers often use sentences without clear subjects. For example, "It seems there may have been some misunderstanding. People might have felt uncomfortable. Something appears to have gone wrong." These statements sound polite. They sound careful, but something crucial is missing. The subject. Who misunderstood? Who felt uncomfortable? Who caused the problem? When the subject disappears, responsibility disappears with it. Yet the person who speaks these sentences gains something else. They gain interpretive authority. They become the person who defines the meaning of events. And influence without accountability is one of the most dangerous forms of power in any organization. The essential principle leaders must restore. If organizations wish to avoid this trap, they must restore a very simple discipline. Facts must be separated from interpretations. Statements must contain subjects. Decisions must have identifiable decision makers. Without these elements, language becomes a fog in which responsibility dissolves. And once responsibility dissolves, leadership loses its foundation. The final lesson. We have now explored how the distortion messenger operates within relationships and organizations. Their influence does not depend on aggression. It depends on ambiguity. They survive where communication is indirect. They grow stronger where responsibility is unclear. And they thrive in environments where emotional mediation replaces structural decision-making. But there is also good news. Once these patterns become visible, they lose much of their power. Because the strongest defense against distortion is surprisingly simple. Direct conversation, transparent decision structures, and language that clearly identifies who said what, who decided what, and who is responsible for what. These practices may appear basic, but in reality, they are the foundation of both organizational health and philosophical clarity. They are, in a sense, the organizational equivalent of leaving the bardo, moving from confusion into awareness. In our next lecture, we will explore this phenomenon even more deeply. We will analyze the linguistic strategies used by distortion messengers, how they blur responsibility, merge facts with interpretations, and quietly reshape the power structure of communication. Understanding these language patterns will give you a powerful new skill, the ability to recognize distortion the moment it begins. If this discussion helped you see human relationships and leadership in a new light, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this lecture. Because clarity about human behavior is not just philosophical knowledge. It is one of the most practical leadership skills we can develop.